About building houses, making things out of wood, and his is about burning them down.
From there, not much.
But we have some questions to ask each other, and then you can ask questions of either of us.
And if you get frustrated with us, raise your hand and we'll just go from there.
Yes. But I have the first question. So David, how did the end of Good Intentions begin?
Well, it really began a couple of years before I retired. I wrote a story that was, in fact, the first chapter of this novel. And it got published, it won an award, that was great. I retired. I said that one of the reasons I was retiring was so that I could write, and then I thought, well, I really should try to make good on that. And I had no idea what I was going to do, but then this story kind of came back into focus, and I thought, you know, I think there's more to be said about these characters. And originally, my intention was that the book was going to become a kind of accordion book, in that one chapter would introduce, would take care of one character's story, but in the midst of that chapter, it would introduce a character who would pick up the story and carry it along. And that sort of happened, but I hit chapter 3, and I hit the one first-person narrator in the book, and he sort of threatened to take over things, and so the scheme broke down pretty early on. But that's how it began.
But he was a good one to take over.
Yeah, I hope so.
And I don't know if David was going to explain this, but during the pandemic, we were in a writing group that was all on Zoom. It was the two of us were from here, but then Howard was in the Bay Area, and Nancy in Southern California. There was that woman writing pornography, and
believe me, it made it really fun to go to writing group. I learned things.
And the woman doing historical fiction in Canada.
Right.
I mean, we had a really interesting group.
One of them, Jim Brennan's book, just came out this last week.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
So if you're
everyone published from that group. I mean, it was amazing.
Okay, so my question is really pretty similar, and that is for Deb to talk about the genesis of At Home. When did you begin, and did your conception for the book change over time? And what were some of the things that you learned in the process of writing and designing a home?
Yeah, I think I wrote the book because I want to see more cool architecture in the world. There just isn't enough, and it's kind of depressing to look and see these whole farms turning into crops, these crops of houses coming between here and Sanger, between Sanger and Fresno, and so why would we build a house like we build? We started this as we were building the river house. So we were living in the Creek House, the one on the front cover, the one in Centerville, and we were building this house. That was, we finished the river house in 2011, so that was probably in 2009 that I began writing it. And I was working and I was doing stuff, and so I had ideas, but I didn't, but it took me 15 years to finish it. So you have to be patient. And I thought at first that I would write it as sort of an embedded biographer, and I would write about Arthur Dyson, because I still think he's quite a genius, and his work, his body of work is really, really interesting, and his philosophy of architecture is interesting. I had read the book by Tracy Kidder called Mountains Beyond Mountains. It was a one-book, one college read here. And I thought, I'm going to do something like that. But it was going nowhere, and so it changed, but I still had a story to write, I still had something to say. So I stuck with it. And my theory is really just that authentic architecture, organic architecture, it's more trouble, but it's worth it. And so that's what I'm trying to prove. And what did I learn? Patience, I think, first and foremost. I mean, that's with building the house and with writing the book. putting it all together just took a long time. Everything took longer than I thought, but it was worth it. And sometimes that time makes a difference. I was talking to the architect, the organic architect, Mickey Munich, who lives out in Big Sur. He did the Post Ranch Inn, and he said that the advantage to our house taking so long was that we got to see every single season and every single weather as we were building the house. And he said he did that at Post Ranch Inn. He slept on the property outside for a year before he started designing it. So. David, how does the structure of your book work? Would you call it a traditional novel? I've read it, and I would say it's not traditional. Many of them I read as stories, and they became the novel. Or is it a novel in stories, or is it a collection of related stories? How did you envision it unfolding initially? You said the accordion, but...
Yeah, I kind of leapfrogged into this question, I think, already a little bit, but maybe one last thing I can say is that one of the chapters in the novel was a story that I wrote in 1993 and was published in 1995. And as I was working on the book, it suddenly, because I'm a little lazy and I really like repurposing things, it suddenly occurred to me that what was going on in that one story, that very old story, actually could work in this book. I had to do a little reconfiguring and remaking.
Which one?
It's the chapter called A Holiday for One. I think it's chapter 4, maybe 5, somewhere there. It's relatively early. It's the Susan book chapter where she's at. Well, it's the Ashland Shakespeare Festival
Yes.
chapter. So it's that one. So that one is actually a pretty old piece of writing, but it had a purpose and it found its way into this book. So. As far as writing a novel is concerned, I have 2 books that I've called novels. I'm not sure I've written a novel yet. The only novel I've written is one that hasn't been published. So that's a strike against writing novels. But I'm along with being a little bit lazy, I'm also a little bit afraid of getting started on a project that I call a novel right from the outset. Because you can go years and years and years working on your novel, and it can just be a big pile of crap. And who wants to do that? So my approach has been to get started writing what I think is a story, and if that story leads to another story, I can keep going and I can keep shipping those stories off to magazines and see if anyone wants it. If it doesn't turn into a novel, but it somehow makes its way as a story into a journal, then I feel like I haven't lost any time or energy. So it's not. I wouldn't recommend this approach to anybody. At some point, I will grow up and I will write an honest-to-God novel, but that's where it is.
One of his stories was published last year in the Coolest American Short Stories. It was a year ago tomorrow that Deb and he came to New York, and we all went and saw him read at the KGB Supper Club or something, the KGB bar in New York City.
It was a very red room with a big picture of Lenin and Che.
Oh, yeah.
It was very, very cool. So, okay, for Deb, much of your story regarding the design of the 2 houses that you've had Dyson do for you involves your relationship with art and the role that he played in bringing your own visions to life. You've done this a little bit already in the reading that you did, but maybe you can say a little bit more about describing the working process. How is it maybe different from the usual architect-client relationship? Did that change at all from your first house to your second? And did you ever see connections in that relationship to the relationship between yourself and your students?
Let's especially the last one. I love that question. Working with art makes you want to drop everything and devote your life to beauty. So, I mean, that's just the way he is. He has this sort of charismatic sway that I think some people just have. It's the same with my students. They want to drop everything and devote their lives to literature, right? Kidding. Art says that I was unusual because I came to him, and the second time we came to him with a floor plan and definite ideas about the elevation. That, I mean, we were building in the foothills for the second house, for instance, and I said, and the house should mirror those foothills. I want it to be the fancy foothill, but it fits into this landscape. And you wouldn't build that house in town. There are things it has to articulate with the landscape as it is, for example. And he wove that from flax into gold. I find that if a student or a writing buddy comes with an earnest attempt at something, then it's easy to say, oh, this is working here, go with that, or this is not working here and this is why. It's when there's nothing that it's hard. So for students, when you go to a professor and you want help, don't come with nothing, come with something, anything. And say, okay, this is my first attempt, and that's what I would come to art with my first attempt. I mean, I'm a frustrated architect. Lots of people are frustrated architects. People who think that they could draw a house, but you need an architect to do it right, and so that's what I think. So The End of Good Intentions is a novel that presents characters who view their lives within a religious Christian context. What role does traditional Christianity and evangelicalism play in their lives? What do they get out of their religious and or spiritual experience? And how do they respond to the guilt and their own shortcomings?
You know, this is a question I have a hard time answering. You know, in one sense, because it's something that I think we're still kind of living through, you know, religiously and politically right now. And I think, you know, it's become very, very difficult to separate the spiritual from what has become the political. And unfortunately, the term evangelical has kind of lost its saliency to a great degree. And I think, you know, I didn't start out with this. That was not my intention. When I wrote that first chapter, my thought at that point was not a very original thought. And that was that, you know, we had been sort of immersed in this idea of fanaticism and extremism that was always, you know, an accusatory thing for others, Islamic extremists. You know, and we could do it with any other ism. But so often, you know, within Christianity, we never, or very seldom do we hear those terms put together of Christian extremism. And I was just really trying to work through that idea, I think, in that first chapter. And then as I started working on the book, it became more and more a thing that I was thinking about. And then, after I was actually in the process of reading proofs of the book, a friend had suggested I read a book called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Dumas, which really is just kind of a 75-year recapitulation of the evangelical movement and what has transpired over that time. And I don't know if you've been watching the news at all, but there's another book out now called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta, who's a writer for The Atlantic magazine. And that's all he's exploring really is this conjunction of the religious and the political and how things have kind of corrupted each other. So, you know, my sense here, one of the things that I really do feel kind of badly about in this book is I'm not sure that any of the characters have anything like a true spiritual experience. They're
on their way.
They're just kind of mucking along, yeah, and doing the best they can. Those that are trying, there are others in the book who don't even bother to try. They're just using religion for its own purposes. So, revision.
Yes.
You said this book took a while.
It went through many
revisions. So it's an ongoing part of the process of writing a book and designing a home. Have you found your experience of revising a book or a house informing your experience of revising the other?
I am a consummate reviser. I revise and revise and revise and revise and revise and revise. And so does art. Any artist of any kind really has to, unless, I mean, even photographers that I've watched do architectural photography, they're there all day long trying to get the light just right, and they're working with different exposures, doing it over and over and over and over again. I think the most interesting revision story in the house is the second house, the river house, that we said we wanted it to be 2,000 square feet, period, and we had certain ideas. It was 2 stories at the beginning, and that two-story first draft, if you will, turned into 2,400 feet, and all the changes were great, but the bids came in twice our budget. And so I can remember a day I was wearing a Reedley sweatshirt. It was a Friday, and I went and taught one class. I'd just gotten the bid, taught one class, and then drove straight to Art's office, and then just started sobbing in his conference room. It was twice what we could afford, and I'd been through this with him once before on a project that was unbuilt, and he said, don't worry, and I said, I am worried. We have to take the top off, and that's essentially what we did. We made it one story, which took all of the structural elements of a 2-story house, including a staircase, out of the house, put the bedroom downstairs, and it is now just under 2,000 square feet, and it's perfect. It's much better than the 2-story iteration. Okay, we don't have the library with the view that looked out over the foothills, but but that's okay. And most writing, I think mine is disorganized, imagine that, is disorganized and wordy, but when you work on it and massage it and bring it down, prune it down, I always say pruning, like pruning a tree, right? And so it needs to be pruned in order to blossom. And so most writing is too wordy until you spend a lot of time revising it, distilling it, bringing it down. So let it sit for a bit. What if we did this?
So now I have a new metaphor for revising. Pruning we've all heard. But the revising metaphor I really like now is take the damn second floor up.
That's good. So, David, we may recognize similarities between the setting in the book and places in eastern Fresno County that we know well. This audience especially. The drive up to Dunlap area and Cat Haven, for instance. That's in the book. You can see all sorts. Even the locale of Michael's bar. It's something between what the Wake House used to be and what the schoolhouse used to be. Don't you think? How did you choose the setting, and how does place figure in the overall sense of the story?
Well, as a fiction writer, I'm not very inventive. So, my idea of fiction is really it's a Cuisinart of experience. You just throw stuff in and hope something comes out at the other end that you like. So the locale is essentially in this area and taking the 180 up into the hills. The Cat Haven is very much a presence. Right next to the Cat Haven, I put a bar that is really very much modeled on the old Kelly's Beach. Bars in the rafters, gotta have it. So, I just trucked that from the river up into the hills. And then I put a college a few miles further up the road. That college is essentially the college that my wife Deb and I went to up in Portland, Lewis and Clark. So all the architecture, we're speaking of architecture, see, there is another connection.
There we go.
The architecture of the college is essentially the architecture of the college that we went to in Portland. So it's really just a case of me taking things that I know and just mixing it up, shuffling the deck, and seeing where things land. So, our last question. You write about the impact of space and design on people's moods, attitudes, mental health, and well-being. So, what more can you say about architherapy with us?
Yeah, that's a chapter that I read from, and what was it's on the back of the book. Beware of how we shape our buildings, lest they shape us in unintended ways. But I was just thinking, I was talking to Deborah about this is a story that's not in the book because it happened since the book was finished. And this is when we live in New York, we rent out our California house and vice versa. So our renters who were living in the California house, the man's 43 years old. He's from South Africa, like Deborah, and he had a very traumatic childhood. Lots of violence and lots of horrible things happened to him. And he repressed a lot of that. He'd become an autodidact engineer. He's successful in making holograms for big events. He's doing okay. But he, at one point, partway through his stay, he wrote just a little text that I knew I was going to get more of, and I did. He said, "Thank you so much for this house. I've had a major breakthrough from living here." And so then when we saw them, when we were coming and they were going, we took a day, and he told me over the course of a couple of hours what had happened in his childhood and how being in this place that was so calming and so restorative had changed his life. I mean, he's weeping and he's just describing what had happened to him. But this is more dramatic than I myself have experienced. But for him, it was transformative. And when we leave in April, they're coming back for next year. So it's pretty exciting.
And so that means there's going to be a second edition of the book with an appendix.
Yeah, I don't know if I can write that story. So do you have questions for us? I've read David's book. It's really good and really interesting, and you'll identify with a lot of the places. Each story, these characters come alive. You'll feel like you know them by the end of the book. And David has spent a lot of time in my house, so we can answer each other's questions. Go ahead, Sue.
David, the key characters as opposed to the also characters, the peripheral characters. Tell us a little bit about the two guys in the bar.
Those are side characters.
Yeah, they are definitely side
They
characters.
were quite remarkable.
And what are the two Muppets' names?
Bert and Ernie.
and Waldorf. They're basically modeled on them. That's kind of how I envisioned them. But they are kind of a comic relief pair But what I hadn't anticipated as I was getting toward the end of the book was the fact that their lives would get lifey, you know. They have their own traumas and tragedies that attach to them. And they become a little bit heroic now and then. So they kind of surprised me. They were a lot of fun to write.
I think they're Shakespearean.
Yeah, they may be a little bit of a dog body in there too.
Yeah. Would you ever consider writing fiction? And David, would you consider writing nonfiction? I mean, you're both in your own.
I'm 190 pages into a novel, so yeah, and so I have written some fiction. This is the first time that I've had the time to commit to something like a novel.
And the one time someone asked me to write an essay, I did it, and I swore I would never do it again. Because at least with fiction, you can make stuff up. And with nonfiction, I mean, some nonfiction writers don't feel this obligation, but I actually did feel the obligation to stick with what was factually true. It was
to document everything.
Yeah, it was a little bit like taking a razor blade to my skin. I really wasn't that interested in doing it again. I have done it. I want to.
Yes, Cynthia.
So Deb, you've had long-term guests, you've also had people renting your home and you're not there. Have you ever noticed how they've used the space differently and in an interesting way that you hadn't thought of?
I think that's a really interesting question, and if David Dominguez were here, I would ask him. He lived for a year at the Creek House, and I've been talking to him today, almost sick, and so he couldn't make it. But it was their first house when they were married, and so it was really interesting to see the way that they used the space. My favorite renters ever were a traveling nurse who came, and he brought a violin stand and a crib and a baby, and and that's it. There was a wife, but they were barely even in the house. I think they must have eaten out the whole time also. Otherwise, it's hard to say. There were some huge disappointments along those lines. If that's what you were thinking of, because you've heard some of the stories. We had some people that used the house in ways that weren't appropriate.
The police were called.
The police were called. Yes.
When you create your characters, do you start with a complete character and then write a story to kind of embody that character, or do you make up their characteristics and traits sort of as you go to fit the story you're trying to tell?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I'm not altogether sure if what I'm going to say is even true. But part of it is kind of sentence by sentence, letting the characters emerge, and trying to find what does in fact seem true to the character. Most of the time when I try to predetermine who a character might be, or what a situation is, or where I am in the physical landscape of a story or a book, when I try to predict that ahead of time and write to it, I usually do a really bad job. So if I can, which means I don't plan much, and which means that sometimes when you don't plan much, you get everything that you deserve, which is having to start over. But it also means that for what I'm trying to do in fiction, I'm really trying to have the same experience that I hope a reader will have in discovering things sentence by sentence. So I'm really kind of doing that at the same time as well. And that's really true of the characters that are there on the page.
You said that about your side characters. You get surprised. Oh, I didn't realize this character would do this. There you go.
One of the characters that I wanted to know more about was the Jewish girl that left early. And I wondered, had you imagined more of her story, whatever her denouement was or whatever, it just didn't make it into the book?
Well, she does kind of, there is kind of an ending, because she winds up coming back to Fresno and marrying another police-type person after what, I won't even begin to try to describe her little sexual journey along the way. But the, I kind of tried to wrap things up with her as best I could, recognizing that there were kind of too many characters in this book to really close the door on all of them. So I kind of did what I could with her, and I thought it was, I had my own little, it was my own little joke for myself that she has a really bad experience at the college up in the mountains, and then she goes back to New York to get away from the situation there, and then ultimately she gets married and she winds up coming back to Fresno, which is what Fresno does to all of us.
I paper city.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your routine in writing? Each of you, do you have a dedicated time or amount of time that you spend? Or is it just when it's convenient?
I get up in the morning and write, and I'm usually at 5:30 or 6, and there's even a special light that doesn't get into where Greg is sleeping. The house is so open, and there's glass in between the different rooms. If I turned on a light in the main room, you could see it in the bedroom. But back in the little nook where I write, there's a light that only shines right there. And so if you drive up Elwood early in the morning, you can see me typing through the window. So I do it the very first thing. Then I get restless and do yoga, and then sometimes I go back, and sometimes I go do something else. How about you?
I used to be better. I feel like I'm at a AA meeting for writers. My name is Dave. When I retired, it was like this huge gulf of time opened up for me, and I was happy as a clam. And I was very busy and productive for about the first 2.5 years. Since then, things have slowed down a little bit, and also other distractions have come into view. So I haven't been as good recently, but one of the distractions being some of the classes that I've been teaching for UCLA recently have kind of all of a sudden taken up more time than I anticipated. And but I'm really hopeful to get back to a kind of, generally I'm good from about 7 in the morning until about noon, and then
But that's a good writing morning.
yeah, well, certainly. And when I say I'm good, I'm saying that somewhere in there's about half an hour of actual
Anything else you wonder? We're here.
Oh.
Dave, you often mock religious people or religious religious phonies, but to your credit, you've always gone a little bit beyond a lot of modern writing and asking about the spiritual life and suggesting through everything, almost you write, there's an importance to that. It isn't just a materialistic world, and I think that's greatly to your credit. You'll take on things like that. Deb, you write about architecture and its effects on spirituality. Why don't you guys get together. You can
Put
describe
his
the
character,
setting.
yeah, put his character in my
So,
house.
could you do that? Could you organize your time a little better? than you do?
We'll do one of those pass backs like
Yeah.
they
There
used to
you
do.
I love that. Thank you.
That'd be very fun.
Well, you're welcome, no charge.
How about students? You have any questions?
Oh, be brave.
How many of you are writers? And do you like to write fiction or nonfiction? Fiction. Keep it up.
I think we're good. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.